the great pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Richard Sennett. Richard Sennett is a centennial professor of sociology at the London School of Economics. The Beam is adjunct professor of sociology at MIT and also professor of the humanities at New York University. Born in Chicago, he actually grew up in the Cabrini Green Housing Project. Since age 6, he's also had this parallel reality, which is music, which played a role ever since by actually studying piano and cello. He is the founding director of the New York Institute for the Humanities, and his research entails ethnography, history, and also social theory. The list of books is so long that I can only pick a few. The Craftsman, a book which had an amazing impact on the art world. The Culture of the New Capitalism, The Corrosion of Character, Flesh and Stone, The Conscience of the Eye, The Fall of Public Man, but also fiction, Ballet Royale, An Evening of Brahms, The Frog Who Dared to Croak. Homi Bhabha once said, "If I had to sum up Richard's work, I would say he's always interested in the relation between authority and experience." A very, very warm welcome to Richard Sennett.
Thanks very much. I'm just off the plane, so you have to excuse me if I'm not as coherent as I should be. And I've also decided to change a little what I was going to talk to you about, because I spent most of last week in Zuccotti Park in New York, which is where the demonstrations against Wall Street have been taking place. And I was thinking while I was there about the relationship between that space, protest and resistance, to the sort of pavilion that's here in the Serpentine, done by Peter Zumthor and Ulf Udolf, which is meant to be a hortus conclusus. And so I'd like to just talk to you briefly about what these two spaces, if you compare and contrast them, what they're about. And I might start by saying something about what a classic hortus conclusus is meant to do. It's got a deep cultural charge, both in Islamic culture and in Christian culture, which is it's an enclosed garden in which people are meant to gain self-knowledge by dwelling in the space. In Christian hortus conclusi, is that what you'd say? I have no Latin, so I have no idea. But in a Christian hortus conclusus, the notion was that you were alone and that you were silent. That is, that these were spaces which were asocial, and they were spaces which were non-communicative. Your relation, the monks who worked in these gardens were, for instance, the Carthusian gardens, enjoined as a venal sin not to speak to each other. They had to leave the garden to talk. And the notion is that you dwell on the plants, each of which was charged with symbolic meaning. Most of them were herbal plants, and herbs have this very long association, Christian culture, with various symbols, that you would dwell on these plants. You'd have the sensate experience of smelling and touching them, and that would be the subjective. The plants were the gateway, if you like, to understanding yourself, but alone and in silence. Now, Zuccotti Park is nothing at first glance like a hortus conclusus. I should tell you that this is a private park given over to the public. It's part of a real estate scam that has gone on for a long time in New York, where a private developer will give a public space in order to get back a taller building or building violations of another sort. And the Zuccotti family, who happened to be quite nice capitalists, built a rather nice park and only took they took some, but not all the privileges that they meant to give back. So it's as these scams go, it's a gentle scam, and it's big, and it's at the bottom of Wall Street. When you go there, your first impression of this open space is that it's just the usual political theater, you know, people dressed up with skulls and holding signs, who most of all seem to be young kids, mostly leftish kids doing political theater. If you spend more than a few hours there, you see something else, which was to me more surprising, and I have to say more moving, which is there are lots of people who are more middle-aged. There are even some elderly pensioners. And these people are hanging out in the park. I can't say I conducted a scientific survey of them, but since I spent most of last week there, I began talking to as many as I could. And the middle-aged people are ordinary workers who are out of work and have no place to go, and who have found themselves very, very uncomfortable hanging out in Starbucks or going to museums. They're really people who have been isolated and individuated. And the park is a place where they can go, where they're surrounded by sympathetic people, and in which their plight is something which is a kind of common bond. So there are lots of them. And the pensioners are people, some of them quite frighteningly vigorous, I may say, whose pensions have been cut, and they're mad as hell. And they outdo many of these kids in the vigor of what could be described as their outrage. So it has the feeling for the kinds of people that newspaper photographers photograph of being conclusives, that newspaper photographers don't photograph, these rather uninteresting looking middle-aged and elderly people, as we are, well-dressed and so on. It is a shelter. It's a kind of shelter, a kind of protection from feeling exposed to what these unemployed people are going on, experiencing in the outside world. And I'd say about this that the quality of shelter is not a question of simple presence, but it's something that's enacted, that binds these people together, and I'm going to explain to you, and I'll do this very, very briefly, how that works. When I spoke at Zuccotti Park, I've done that 3 times now. What happens is the following. There are no megaphones. There's no electronic amplification. It's a way that the park can be inhabited without a permit. And so what happens is that when you talk, you'll say a sentence or two, and they have to be short, memorable, and then a body of the people in the park will repeat the sentence or two, and then another body behind them farther away will repeat it again. Now, for a loquacious person like me, this was sheer torture. But it means that everybody is involved in this performance, which gets around the need for this kind of electronic stuff, which gets around the need for a permit, which is why this happened at all. And not only do people repeat things in these short phrases, if they like what you do, they go like this to you. And if they don't like what you do, they go like this to you. I would say of my 3 speeches there, I got more this than this, but it's quite, for a speaker, not, well, it's an unusual experience. For the audience, it's fantastic because they are enacting their presence almost sentence by sentence. And I found for the people that I got to know, I got to know a couple of middle-aged postman who had just been let off work. This was an incredibly energizing experience for them, that, you know, this or this was something that really made sense to them. So it's conclusus. It has that quality, but it has a quality of being protected, but not being silent, nor being alone. But is it then a garden? Is a pack of protesters a garden, a hortus? Now, here's where the visual person in me got going. And I think there are two kind of abstract relationships between that kind of a space and what's just across the way in this amazing pavilion, which, thanks to you, exists. Is this its last day? This is its last day. You want to look at it. I wouldn't say this is a political space, but it shares something with the political space. And the first of these, I say this is a rather just flaky comparison, but I would say that my impression of people in Zuccotti Park was rather like Udolph's plants. That is, that they're highly compressed together, this crowd of people, as with the crowd of plants, but that the edges between different kinds of people are very uncertain. They're, in technical jargon, they're liminal. You don't know where one group of plants begins and another kind of plant ends. And that kind of liminality between different kinds of people is probably the most striking thing humanly about Zuccotti Park. That is, there are assigned areas for what you want to do. If you need to pee, there's one place which has lots of porta cabins. If you want to make a sign, there's another area, and so on. But there's very little segregation between different kinds of people, and particularly when people sleep there at night, which some of these frightening pensioners have begun doing so that they can get going in the morning, you have a park carpeted with lots of different kinds of people all sleeping together. And as I say, just as a visual impression, it looked a little to me like what Piet had done in the planting next door, which is you get a feeling of solidarity because there are these liminal rather than absolute limits. And the second thing about it, visually, and as I say, this is just a riff, was I was very struck by the blackness of Peter's walls. When I've seen this several times, this pavilion. When I went to Zuccotti Park and started thinking about this, by looking at the color of the policemen who surround it. Now, I know this may seem to be absolutely nonsense, but let me tell you what I mean. Zuccotti Park is surrounded by policemen who are not unfriendly, particularly the patrolmen, who know that they are probably one paycheck away from being laid off themselves. But they're serried around in ranks double deep. And when you're in the park, what you see, there's a canopy of trees on two sides. But what you see all around you is this wall, dark blue wall of fabric, policemen standing up. And they're there 24 hours a day. These it's boiling hot last week in New York, and you see them sweating through these things. So that there is a kind of permanent wall of dark wall. The police tried kettling on only one occasion, where they compress crowds together, which is when we went along the Brooklyn Bridge. But the park itself is not like that. The wall is porous, but it throws you more and more back on the presence that the immobility of these policemen, that you are also being in this space, that you're not moving out of it, that you're dwelling in this space. And they're a kind of the neutrality that makes you focus more and more on the relations to each other. And that's what I think has gone on architecturally with this amazing pavilion next door, which is, of course, beautifully calculated. All of its dimensions are there's nothing left to chance about it. But I think the impression, I don't know if you have this when you visited, but the impression for me, being inside Peter's construction, is something to focus you away from the building as a building and to focus you on being the space inside. I think that's why it's black, you know? So there's something I found very striking about that, and maybe I can just summarize this comparison by talking about a hortus conclusus more largely, derived from either its political or something like this, which is a kind of quasi-religious manifestation. What a hortus conclusus is a suspension in time to recover the self. It's a suspension in time rather than an experience of motion in space. But this inner condition is something that's materially created. It's created by a space which suspends the body, divorcing it from the outside world and concentrating the body on something outside of itself. Any Christian monk would understand what I've just described to you. But as urban planners and urban designers, we don't tend to think about subjectivity in space in quite that way. We're so focused on motion and on connections between one space and another, between openness, that we sometimes forget that enclosure and stillness are the conditions of self-knowledge. And what I'd say to you is that that's as true politically as it is religiously. Thank you very much.